Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, neutrals. It's another day in another week, and I have a few things I want to say about voting. We as a people, and it involves white people too, but us to a greater extent, we do not vote in the numbers that we should. If you want to know how to attack your enemy, study that enemy, whatever that enemy fears the most, whatever that enemy would like to keep you from having and making use of, is the very thing you ought to run to and grab and hold on for dear life. When it comes to black people in this society, although the Constitution says that anybody born in this country or naturalized, that means you come from another country, you go through the rigmarole, you take an examination, and you gain citizenship. But anybody born or naturalized in this country is automatically a citizen. That does not and never has applied to black people. If it did, we wouldn't need special so-called civil rights legislation, anti-discrimination, laws at the state and federal level which are designed to give to us a small amount at least of what white people can take for granted. Voting is what the enemy, and by that I mean somebody who in a systematic way does things to harm us as a people. The thing that the enemy fears the most, and has demonstrated it throughout society and throughout history, is the vote. These white people want to get into office. They know where the seat of power is. They know where the buttons are that people in power push and things happen. If I'm a big shot running a corporation, I will sit behind my mahogany desk, a high-back chair, look very important, but under my desk, I have a panel of buttons that I can tell which is which just by feel. And they are buttons that are connected to something. There are wires that run from these buttons. And if I push button A, there are screens, there are receptors that light up or make sounds somewhere. And if you looked at all of these different wires that all of these big shot white businessmen have, and you were able to draw a very thin line representing each one of those wires, and take a map of the United States and have all of those wires represented, it would look like a spider who was drunk had been weaving a web, single strand fashion, all over the country, then outside of the country. In other words, they push buttons and something happens. We push a button, and if the doorbell does ring and somebody looks out and sees it's us, they either don't open the door or they slam it in our face. I'm speaking metaphorically now in some instances. White people have not been as afraid of us getting jobs as they are of us voting, because once we get into the company, they can control us. We can go no farther, no higher than they desire to have us go. They can lay traps and do tricks that will justify them in firing us if we get out of line. They want us to be such toms that we can step on the boss's shoe without disturbing the shine. They want us to be such pussyfooters that you could stretch a piano keyboard from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, in other words, all the way across the United States, and we could dance across that entire keyboard without striking a note. Those are the kind of people who make it to some extent if they're of our complexion, of our derivation, because there are some people light enough to, quote, pass, unquote, for white, but they choose not to. They know that somewhere in that family tree, somebody crossed the line. So we have a set of circumstances where that enemy does everything to keep us from having power. Voting is what that weapon is. When there were black and white young people demonstrating around the country after George Floyd was murdered on television, I participated in some of those, they called them marches or whatever they called them, and I did it so that at some point they would stop and I would have a chance to address them. I would tell them, sometimes we'd wind up at the courthouse. We'd be in the courtyard of the courthouse, and I would say, look at that big gray building over there with those windows. Behind those windows are offices. In those offices are politicians. They look out the windows and they see all of these young people here. But your mere presence doesn't bother them. The police will keep you from reaching them, so they fear nothing physical. What they will do is check the voter rolls. Are these young people now registering to vote? Have they come to understand where real political power lies? If the registration rolls don't increase, they'll let you march until you wear holes in the bottoms of your shoes. They give the police a chance to practice their rhythms on your head with a nightstick. They can use various canisters of various chemical substances to get as close to you as they can and squirt it in your face, hopefully from their view, in your eyes. You have the numbers, but they're numbers without power or force. This is a highly politicized society. Politics is the lifeblood of this society, whether you like it or not. There is no other activity where literally billions of dollars are spent and you get no concrete or tangible product in return. All you purchase with that money, or you hope to purchase, is influence. You have influence if you can deliver votes. There are people hired, and their only job is to try to get people to register for one party or the other. So let's say that the message gets through that registering is important. The next thing the politicians will do is see the increase of registered voters because they have access to this information, the numbers. They want to watch the turnout. Do these registered people signify those who will vote? And when the voting turnouts are low, politicians can ho-hum and forget you. In this society, young people like to see themselves as the generation that will save the country. If you don't get some political clout, your voice is a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. Nobody is going to listen. And that guy called, or known as St. Paul the Apostle, said in 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, and have not charity, which meant love, my words are a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. If you register but you don't vote, everything you say is a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal, and you wonder why politicians won't listen to you when you turn out in large numbers. The power resides in the vote. What your enemy fears the most, what your enemy does the most to keep you from obtaining is the very thing, as I said earlier, is the thing you ought to run to and grasp and hold on for dear life. We as black people have never voted in the numbers that we should. There are people who literally laid their lives on the line and died to vindicate the right of black people to register and vote. White people have always taken care of their own. In the southern and rural areas of this country in the earlier days, white people could not read or write. But they would have black people meet the requirement to read and write. So if you could read, they would ask you to read, then quote from memory, the first 3 articles of the United States Constitution. And since Jesse James is the registrar and Frank James is the one guarding, and you're the poor person here with a few nickels in your pocket and they want them, you're not going to be able to read well enough to satisfy these racists. So what do they do for the white people who in the South and other rural areas are ignorant, illiterate, and unable to read? They will say, if you had a relative who voted in an election so many and so many years ago and nobody knows whether it's true or not, then you don't have to take a test, a literacy test. You get in by riding the coattails of one of your forebears. And that's where the so-called grandfather clause came on. If your granddaddy did it, that automatically entitles you to do it. This is the way white people take care of their own and let that power flow even though they don't reach the standards that they set for us. Let's say that you could pass the reading test, whatever it was. Then you know what they would ask you? How many windows are there on the west side of the courthouse? Who has counted those? You flunked. Let's say black people catch on and they know that's what they might be asked. So they ask you, how many windows are there on the west side of the courthouse? You tell them. Excuse me. On the east side, you tell them. But the white man who's in this position, like the devil, was a trickster and a liar from the beginning. Excuse me. So there is another test. How many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? And these are things that were actually done to keep us from voting. Dogs were set on young people who were trying to get people to vote, register first, and then vote in the South. Fire hoses were brought out against them. Clearly, violations of human and every other kind of right and even laws on the books. The violence gratuitously inflicted on young black people. You need to know your enemy. Things rocked on. There were certain laws put on the books that would allow us generally to vote. But we won't vote. We say my vote doesn't count. It doesn't count because we don't cast it. Nobody is going to respect you when you fail to use the tool that is readily available, so you don't have to be whining, crying, begging, and pleading all the time. You can stand upright on your feet like an adult and look this other adult, white one, in the eye, and you don't have to blink. You don't have to come into a room where he's sitting down and you're standing up and you reach in your pocket and bring out some sand and you spread it on the floor and you go shuffling up to him, sliding on the sand, and say, "Pardon me, boss, I just graduated from the cool school." A clown, a joke, a jokester. Vote. Register and vote. If we read history, and we don't have to go back too far, we can see where people did literally lay their lives on the line. Medgar Evers was assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Malcolm, although he was a Muslim and talked about things other than voting, was assassinated. And Malcolm's watchwords were, by any means necessary. You don't have to use or resort to extraordinary means if you will just vote. Our district, the 11th Legislative District, number 2 City Council District, are not taken seriously because we don't vote in large enough numbers. But if we were doing that, as some will do in the South, you know what these white people do? They draw the lines to include this territory that has a lot of white people, exclude this territory that has a lot of black people, and it's called gerrymandering. And you know where that term came from? If you read history, a guy named Elbridge Gerry, Gerry, was the first one who started utilizing that. And as he drew these lines that wiggled and squiggled and went all kind of ways, they said, that looks like a salamander. But since Elbridge Gerry was the one who did it, they didn't call it a salamander, they called it a gerrymander. There are so many things in history that we need to master. Malcolm said, the study of history is the subject best able to reward our endeavors or expenditures of energy. All that a white person has to do is be born in this country, and he or she does have all of the rights promised by the Constitution and the laws. A white person from another country can get off the boat. He or she will get off the boat on Saturday. Then Monday, he or she is your boss because he or she can become a citizen. They have to go through some steps, but I'm doing this to make a point. White people take care of their own. White people, though, are outnumbered on this planet. I'm not going to go off into that because I would take more time on that and not make the point. When I got sent to the legislature by wise black people, I wore sweatshirts and jeans. And when white people ask me, why did I dress that way? I say, well, if you'd worry less about how I dressed and more about the rules and the way that I study the rules, you would do better than I do. But let me tell you this. Before I came here, and while I'm here, I'm a barber. If what I wear is suitable and good enough for the people who give me my living, certainly it's good enough for people down here who are going to show themselves to be my enemy. So don't worry about how I dress. You pay attention to the rules. And I became a master of the rules. I became known as the King Cobra. And my mantra was, the King Cobra, does not waste venom on dead or fleeing things. So if a bill came up for a vote and it made no difference one way or the other, I wouldn't say anything, and people would ask me, why didn't you say anything? I said there's no need to because it's a pee-wee bill. It doesn't mean anything. If it passes, then come see, come saw. If it doesn't pass, come see, come saw. It's a bill, when you look at it, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't do anything. Then go on and pass it. And you wouldn't worry about anything from me. You're wasting your time, but you're passing time. And to me, in that legislature, time was valuable because I knew how to consume it. I mastered all of the rules in their book. They enshrined me in the rule books. They have rules in their books, rule book, even today, put there specifically to try to stop me, and it never did. One reporter had written that a wise woman had told him that the governor controls the purse strings in the state, but Senator Chambers sets the agenda. And I could tell them, you're not going to move this bill today. And I could write an amendment on the spur of the moment. How would I do it? I understand grammar. If bills are divided into sections, let's say that a section has a statement that comprises 30 words. Right there I have 30 amendments. How do I get them? I offer an amendment to strike each one of those words. I get 10 minutes to give my opening. Then I can speak 2 more times, 5 minutes each. That's 20 minutes. Then I have the opportunity to have 5 minutes to close. I can take 25 minutes with an amendment that simply says, remove this word, or I can add a word, or I can substitute a word. And it's why if they tried to be tricky and did not make their amendment or provision available so that it would be printed in the journal and offered it on the spur of the moment, it had to be printed and put on our desk, and it just put that amount of ammunition into my hands, not through the rule book, but through the printed amendment that was offered. They'd come around and say, Ernie, do you see anything wrong with this that you're against? And I'd say, They say, is there anything we can do to take away your opposition? If there was, I would tell them. If there wasn't, I would say no. Then they'd go to the speaker and tell the speaker, Ernie doesn't like this. It's going to take a long time. People will get angry at me because they'll feel that I'm giving Ernie all this time and they can't get to their bills. So I would like to pass over this bill today. And that's how I stopped a bad bill without even fighting, without working up a sweat. I mastered the rules and I knew how to apply them. I was called the master of the rule book, and I'm enshrined in the rule books to this day. I'm enshrined in their Constitution. How? Through term limits. They couldn't get me out because black people were wise and knew what they had with me in that legislature. So they said, then we'll fix it so that he cannot run after 2 terms. And they got it. Editorial writers saw what they were doing and said how unwise it was. Former senators talked about how unwise they were and that it was all to try to stop one man, and then I mocked and ridiculed them. I said, you got something in your Constitution that will temporarily remove me because after I sit out a term, I can come back and I will be back. I said, but I'm taking all 48 of you with me. There are 49 senators. And I'd say, this is my legislature. I own this legislature. You all are my white folks. But if a bill is essential and must be passed, I will allow you to pass it. If it has merit, I will help you pass it. A loaded brain is more powerful than a loaded pistol unless you're in a gunfight. See, I'm intelligent also. I could be giving one of my most inflammatory or inspirational speeches, as they call it, and I'm making one point after the other, and somebody puts a pistol on my nose and say, Ernie, you say one more word and I'll blow your brains out. I'm intelligent. Silent night. They didn't know how to cope with me. They didn't know how to deal with me. They had nothing that I wanted. They couldn't take anything from me. The lobbyists who control them will tell them, don't upset Ernie because he will hurt my bill. And then lobbyists would come to me and ask me, is there anything that can be done to this bill that will take away your opposition? And if there was, I would tell them, they'd take away my opposition, and I'd let the bill go without even speaking on it. But because there were different bills dealing with different subjects, they never knew when that would happen. One of the senators said, Ernie's got the power of Nero. If people were in the arena in the days of Rome and they were fighting the beasts or whatever, and one of them was under the control and at the mercy of one of these gladiators, If Nero turned thumbs up, everybody turned thumbs up, and the person was allowed to live. If Nero turned thumbs down, the person who was in charge had to kill the individual. One senator said Ernie has become the Nero of the legislature, and that's an awesome power. If he says a bill lives, it lives. If he says it dies, it dies. Not everything that I attempted was successful, but it was successful to a marked degree, to such an extent that I could run that legislature. And they called the legislative chambers Ernie's Chambers. All kind of little things. You know how I got into the legislature? I could have been the wisest, most erudite, to use one of their words, most articulate persons walking in shoe leather, but I couldn't have gotten into the legislature if more people had not voted for me than they did anybody else who was running for the office. It reached the point where people wouldn't even bother to run. Well, I was, after term limits, after 2 sessions, I was term limited out. I waited 4 years and I came back. And the first thing out of my mouth was the words, before I was so rudely interrupted by term limits. People began to say how it was a high cost to pay to try to stop one person and you got term limits. I said, right, because when I go, I'll take 48 of them with me, and then I'll be back. I served 2 more years. I was term limited out. By the time that 4-year term was over, and at that time I told people that if my health was good and my mind was clear, I'd consider it. They took that as a promise to run again. But the promise being made must be kept. If I was not clear enough and the people that I care about took it as a promise, and maybe they were playing a trick on me because they wanted me back down there, I said, if that's what my words conveyed to you, then I'll keep my word. And a few days before the deadline for filing for the legislature, I filed again. Well, the Democratic Party didn't like that because the person who is there, and by the way, he got there when I was term limited out because I endorsed him. I had known nothing about him, but he was a young man. He was going to law school. He was a champion wrestler, which meant he had some heart, because on the mat it's just you and that other person. It's not like a team sport where if you mess up, other people make up for it, and it doesn't make that much difference. He was going to law school. I was going to law school while I was in the legislature, and even before. So when I looked at the other ragtag and bobtail people running, and there were those who had sold out numerous times, I endorsed him and he won. Well, now the piper must be paid. The people in this district, and I don't mean 1 or 2, said you got to run because while you were not there, all kinds of crazy things happened in the legislature. COVID-19 occurred, and that was occurring before I got out through term limits. And that's a word that tells you information. So COVID-19 is like a code that tells you when this particular branch of virus came into being, the year that it came into being, and that's where COVID-19 came from. If you look at things, you see that there is a logic to it. So I got all of my shots. Every shot, well, 2 of them, a shot and a booster. When I got them, I would drop down and do one time 25 push-ups, another time 30, just to show them that I was in good health. I wasn't taking the shot because I was sick right then and had to try to get well. Prevention is better than cure. Don't get sick in the first place. So every time I got my COVID shot, I notified the media, and they wanted to be there. Sometimes television people, other times the print media, sometimes both of them. And I was trying to show by example what I thought was best for all people, not just black people. But I said, we as black people perish because we don't have an understanding. And I'd quote Bible verses because we are rooted and grounded in the Bible. Even if we can't read, we hear some verses quoted so often that we know them as though we could read. So I would quote the verse, "My people are destroyed or perish for lack of knowledge." By not knowing and understanding the nature of the COVID virus and the value of the vaccine, we wouldn't get the vaccination. Then when we got the disease, it was almost too late. Johnny Rogers, who was an unbelievable and incredible athlete, he was not very large, but they wound up calling him Johnny the Jet, and he won the Heisman Trophy. Johnny didn't take it seriously. Johnny got COVID, and he almost died. His sister made fun of him, saying, "You're as thin as my finger." And he talked about it. He survived, fortunately, that he had to get his air, he said, in sips, a sip of oxygen at a time. He had no strength, but he did basically recover. So we ought to listen and take to heart those things that would be of value to us. Don't run your head against a brick wall to demonstrate that you don't think it's hard, and then you find out it's hard. I said knocks your brains out, but you don't have any brains, or you wouldn't be running your head against a brick wall. If you see somebody else run against a brick wall, he falls, another, and you see 100 of them do it, why would you think that you're the 101st and you can do it and you won't meet the same fate? We have to read. We have to study. We have to come to an understanding of the truth. What is my truth? I don't have enough time to go into it today because I took so much time with preliminaries. But I'm going to read a few things about what happened while I was in the legislature. But there are three very important things. We couldn't get people on the city council, the school board, or the county board because they ran at large. That meant when people put their name on the ballot, everybody in that particular political subdivision voted. So we, being a very small minority, never could put anybody on. A couple of times there were black people who the white people felt safe about, so they let them get on the school board. But there was very little they did. I wanted to create a system where it didn't matter what white people think or how they felt. Even if we made a mistake as black people, it would be our mistake, and we wouldn't make the same mistake again. The system is called district elections. You divide the political subdivision. If there are 7 people on the board, then you divide it into 7 districts. And because the Supreme Court knew that white people would gerrymander, they had to be compact, contiguous districts, the lines. That meant you couldn't stretch something way out like a salamander. And there would have to be, to the extent possible, a community of interest taken into consideration. Do these people that are going to be in this district have enough in common so that their voting will mean something and they can get somebody of their choice? I did it first with the school board. The governor vetoed it 3 times. Finally, I overrode his veto, and we were able to elect somebody to the school board of our choice. I think Brenda Council may have been the first one. She may have even been the president of the school board. The next tree to fall was district elections for the city council. That was even more difficult because it involved politicians. They made decisions where developers and other people who spent a lot of money wanted to control a majority of the people on the city council. So since the running for the position was at large, they could put money into a few people's campaigns, and those people would win. And that's how these big interests controlled everything. We ran for the city council. I think I even ran for the city council once, ran for the school board. No chance, but just to demonstrate that no matter what we had going for ourselves, we couldn't elect anybody. That bill also was vetoed several times. But I'm going to tell you how I lucked up on it. I lost a bill that meant a great deal to me. People think that the only time I got a bill passed to abolish the death penalty was a few years ago. In 1979, I persuaded the legislature to vote to abolish the death penalty, but a governor named Thone vetoed it, and I couldn't get enough votes to override his veto. My city council bill came to his desk, and the prior governor had always vetoed it. This particular white governor had people come to him and say, "You can't do this to the same man twice, and everybody will see what you're doing." So, whereas he vetoed my death penalty bill, it was like a trade, quid pro quo. He vetoed that, but he allowed my district election for city councils to pass. The last of the three, of the Trinity, was the Douglas County Board. The county is much larger, and there were not as many people on the county board. The districts would be larger, but the black people would be concentrated in one district, and if whoever wanted to run for that particular district, even though there were white people in it also, could marshal the votes of enough of the black people, they could get elected. And that happened. A black woman was the first one of our complexion, of our racial derivation, to get on this county board. The same thing had happened with the school board, and it may have happened with the city council. But Brenda had gotten on the city council too. Then she ran for mayor and came within a few hundred votes of beating Hal Dobb, but she couldn't quite make it over the hump. And to run for mayor, it's citywide. This year, there's a black man who's going to run for mayor against Gene Stothert, and his last name is Ewing. You might know some Ewings who live in Omaha, and I'm going to support him. I told him that. I said, but now, if my endorsing you will hurt you, tell me and I won't mention that I'm going to support you. He said, that's not the way I see it. So I'm going to support him. He right now is the city treasurer. He's the one who handles things like license plates, but not just license plate text, automobile taxes and so forth, but the treasurer handling all the city's money. That's a generalized statement. He has won that office more than once. People have seen him operate. He is very efficient, and nobody has found fault with the way he ran that office. If he wanted to, he could stay there until he qualified for a pension. And his pension would be, I don't know how many thousands of dollars, but a pension is when they give you money for doing nothing after you don't do something or do nothing in office for a while. But actually, Brother Ewing has done things that are of value. He has even made it less of a joke when it comes to the Department of Motor Vehicles. The DMV is everybody's standard joke all over the country. That's the worst place to have to go for anything. But at any rate, he could stay there as long as he wanted to and retire with a handsome pension. But he sees a brighter future that's available for all the people in Omaha. And he wouldn't do things just for black people, but he'd make sure we're not left out. He sees the ridiculousness of having hundreds of millions of dollars invested in a streetcar that starts nowhere and ends up no place, going a short distance from downtown into the the county hospital or someplace, or the medical center, who is going to be going there? And it would justify not only the expenditure of all this money, but the reconfiguring of streets and so forth. So she has shown that she's at the beck and call of a lot of people who have money and not our interests. We don't have good bus service in our community now, so she has all these hundreds of millions of dollars spent to make a streetcar line that starts nowhere and ends nowhere. So I'm going to support Brother Ewing, and that's what we have to learn how to do. So I'm getting to the end of my time, and I didn't go where I really wanted to go. I was going to talk about the Palestinians and what is happening to them at the hands of the Israelis, but how the International Criminal Court is going to issue an arrest warrant for Prime Minister Netanyahu and also the person who is the head of Hamas for violating human rights and the kinds of engaging in the kind of conduct that violates international law. That court has condemned what Israel is doing. South Africa has a matter pending before the UN that would condemn Israel, and now other countries are joining South Africa and asking for the opportunity to put their country in line with South Africa. But here's the irony. Jews were run out of a lot of countries in in Europe, and a lot of them gravitated to South Africa and joined that government in crushing black people under that racist system called apartheid, the most racist, cruel system that ever existed before or since. A bill that I got through the legislature that said no country that does business with or in South Africa can have any investment of state funds. That passed. All of Nebraska's money that was invested in companies, and a lot of companies did business in or with South Africa because it was so lucrative, the return, because the more businesses that supported South Africa, the more it propped up that government, and they were rich. A lot of the Jews that went from Europe went to South Africa and joined these racists in suppressing black people. Then they decided that they'd like to have a country of their own. So, and I'm shortening all this because I don't have time and it's too involved, but they started migrating to Palestine. There was no Israel, but Palestine was a country. It was a nation, and the Jews settled there. And then through shenanigans and manipulations, they, in 1948, had the area where they had stolen from the Palestinians declared to be the state of Israel. It became the so-called Jewish state. Then, like a plague, and this is not on every Jew, the ones who ran it began to steal and encroach on the land of the Palestinians, and pretty soon they took over, and you see what's happening today. And you know, when you run like I run, and you run a mile in 4 minutes, when you run 3 minutes, you just know that automatically, and you know when you got 1 minute left. And I figure I probably have run 3 minutes of my 4-minute mile, so I probably got about a minute left, and I'm going to wrap it up without having to have the hammer dropped on me. I'm going to, from time to time, talk about voting, and I will give some examples specifically from various states of how things were done to keep black people from voting, and then show examples of how when black people voted, things changed because they had their fingers and thumbs on the buttons of power. And there was something that button was attached to, like these big shot white men. And when you hit this button, there were currents that went through these wires, and something happened here, it happened there, and it happened to the other place. Without voting, we're going to be whiners, complainers, and beggars forever. And some people might be saying right now, well, suppose you encourage a lot of people to vote and they don't vote for you. Well, it's bigger than me. It's more important than me. I'm one person. I don't have a lot of time left on this earth anyway. If I have 100 years, that's not much time. We have to look at what's best for our group. And the best thing for our group is to be in a position to make a decision as to who we want, who we think is our best, in our best interest. And when I was in the legislature, I would tell people how to file and run against me. And if they didn't have the money, they might could do it in paupers where you didn't have to pay the filing fee. And I said, but if you lose me, oh yes, you lose a good thing. But I wanted the people to be in a position to select whom they chose. I had a history and a record, and from time to time, I'm going to read from some of the things and of the things that I had done. From the time I was arrested and put in jail for standing on the step of the barber shop and looking at a cop who had parked his cruiser in the bus zone while his friend went and got a fish sandwich at the fish house. This cop didn't like me looking at him, so he arrested me and charged me with interfering with an officer. But I can't go through the whole story here because I don't have the time. But those are some of the things I'll mention. The bills that I got passed, the changes that I brought into being, and people thought once they were in place for a while that they'd always been there. So I'll be listing the kinds of things that I did while I was there, and my mind is still clear, my health is good, and somebody can catch me on the street, and if the ground not too dirty, say, Ernie, drop down and give me 25, and I'll give them 25 push-ups. And I'll say, I'm 86. July 10th, I'll be 87. One more year, and I'll have as many years to me as there are keys on the keyboard of a piano. I'm not embarrassed by my age. I'm not ashamed of my age. I think I carry my years well. And if my mind was slipping, I would know it. If my health was bad, I would know it. And I wouldn't want my community to buy a pig in a poke, meaning something that they don't know what it is, but they hope it's good. So my time now is just about out, and I thank you for yours. So I will say what the canary said when he found out that the cage on the door on the cage was open. I'm out of here.
You've been watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to leave suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This is an EWC Communications production.